May I conclude by speaking briefly of our vision on how economic policy in the next few months will behave. We believe that policies should be centered around pandemic containment and helping recovery. We should not withdraw prematurely fiscal support, obviously also bearing in mind fiscal restrictions faced by countries and the lack of financing availability. This support to demand and households should be accompanied by explicit commitments through laws clearly communicated in order to consolidate and remake fiscal space in the short term. Obviously, as the pandemic begins being controlled through vaccines, medications, and better treatments, we will also have to adopt measures to help us to maintain aggregate values, such as maintaining infrastructure, etc., while strengthening social safety nets, and education and health, of course. Since Latin America is a region that has had rather mediocre growth rates during the last 3 decades, now faces a dual challenge of implementing structural changes required by the region to speed up growth, while at the same time strengthening social indicators and the social safety net, which during this pandemic has obviously not been able to be strengthened because there's not an appropriate network to support the neediest sectors of the population. And with this, we are now open to your questions, and I expect this will be a session that will be extremely interesting. Thank you.
Gracias, Alejandro. Vamos a empezar con una pregunta de F.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. We'll begin with a question from Efe. What are the problems Brazil and Mexico are facing greatest? The answer, well, what the entire world economy is facing in terms of risk is first and foremost the health risk. To the extent the pandemic is not controlled, to the extent that there continue to be hotspots and outbursts, there will continue to be, so long as the virus is not contained, the need for quarantine and distance socialing and ever more radical means of both, and that will hit the economies hard hit. And the means available on the fiscal side will little by little become exhausted, and that will bring on problems of its own. In terms of the pandemic per se, at the stage where the pandemic will recover in Latin America, at any rate, to the extent that you have recovery with greater social inclusion than has been in the past, that alone will be a major challenge. The per capita output in Latin America will be lower than elsewhere in the world, and therefore social indicators will lag. That is why it is imperative that Latin America carry out the structural measures that will pave the way toward greater growth on the one hand, but certainly also greater level of social coverage, greater income distribution, better education, better coverage in health, better inclusive growth. That is the major challenge that faces Latin America. Of course, the fiscal challenge in and of itself is daunting. All of the measures taken over the first months of the pandemic are such that all of the economies will emerge from this difficult period with much greater debt levels, and their credit ratings will, of course, reflect this. It's going to be important that the fiscal discipline be there in order to curb the levels of debt and create the fiscal space necessary for there to be a recovery once another negative shock comes along, such that the region, I should say, is better placed to respond more positively once those future shocks come and when they do. Thank you, Alejandro. We continue to have questions from our colleagues in Mexico, Eduardo Flores from El Universal, from El Economista and El Financiero. all are asking, what is the economic outlook for Mexico? Yolanda Morales asks, for her part, whether the economic construction and very slow recovery that you are foreseeing for Mexico will create instability for the social sectors in 21-22, and what happens in terms of the fiscal regime? What will be the impact on the economy and on public finance in general? Well, as you know, we are expecting the Mexican economy to drop by 9% this year and a recovery next year of 3.5%. The Mexican economy, with the present contraction of 9% in 2020, a minus 9%, is indubitably one of the hardest hit economies in the entire region. And we need to remember, of course, that the manufacturing sector in the U.S. is getting better. There's an uptick in sales of automobiles and uptick also in remittances being sent to Mexico. Those three rubrics will shore up the Mexican economy to an extent. So, too, the fact that we revised upward slightly the expected contraction, which was expected of 10%, which would have been a very hard hit, it's only 9%. But 9% is not nothing. The 9% contraction this year and the 3% growth next year, let's face it, means that these 2 years will have been very bad for the Mexican economy. Now, the teams that have visited Mexico virtually, I should say, found that there was an absolute need for a future tax reform, but also a more aggressive stance towards fiscal public management. And the team wondered whether it wouldn't be a good thing for the Mexican economy to aim for a little more aggression in terms of the GDP sustenance, both to the families and to the companies. And what Mexico has for years guaranteed, and over the last year, which is fiscal sustainability, the discussion of future tax reform would in fact anchor expectations in that regard. Without that future tax reform, frankly, there are a lot of alternatives. There are a lot of open windows here. The fiscal windows in Mexico seem to be positive, and it is felt in some quarters that a present fiscal reform, a future tax reform, and the fact that that tax reform would do two things. First of all, sending a very clear signal of strength and sustainability of public finance in Mexico, that's one, and two, that the position of the government would be strengthened in order to implement more aggressive social policies, such that the policies in Mexico becomes fairer, so that there is greater redistribution in Mexico. Without all of that, of course, there is any number of additional policies that could go some ways to finessing public finance management, but the team in Mexico felt that all in all, that combination would be the best for Mexico. That was the feeling then. Now we have questions from Rafael Matus of La Nación on WebEx. Thank you and good morning, Alejandro. I wanted to ask you briefly about Argentina. 2 years ago, the fund agreed to a program with Mauricio Macri. That program didn't work as expected. So what gives you any optimism this time around with the present group of politicians? Do you think that Argentina is better positioned to have any program work this time around? Well, we in the team are working, of course, with the various ministries of Fernandez. We're working very closely with that team in order to give whatever program the Argentinian authorities feel they want to go with has the best chance. We want to help as best we can on the IMF side. And as your press communique showed when our team ended its trip to Argentina, it is very clear that the right balance needs to be struck between helping the most affected families affected by the pandemic on the one hand, and also aim to bolster the Argentinian economy on the other. Clearly, the firm basis for a return to macroeconomic stability in Argentina is essential, and that is the homework, if you wish, that the Argentinian authorities have before them. Trying to control a volatility on the exchange market, that's true, but basically that is the task that the government has set for itself and is in the process of working through. A comprehensive plan that it is hoped could be buttressed by a financial program from the IMF is what they're betting on. And that's what we are assisting Argentina to work together. We'll be looking at that again in November. The team will be there in November, or looking at it virtually in November, whatever works best, such that whatever program the Argentinian government puts forward is best positioned to move forward. And if, in the view of our technicians, it is and will lead to macroeconomic stability and growth in Argentina, then certainly the fund would be willing to back it with a program, if that is our assessment. And as is usual in those cases, when we think that the probability that a program is high, then we are very decisive when we move forward. The fact that the last time around the program failed need not bode ill for the next time around. Obviously, the society at large in Argentina will have to buy in. There has to be an across-the-board understanding that the program is necessary, and for that to occur, there has to be broad support. That's what we feel. And thank you for your question, Rafael. Thank you, Alejandro. We have another 2 questions from Argentina. One comes from Maria Iglesias from El Clarín newspaper. She said, for a credible plan, do you think that will only happen with an IMF program? And then Franco of Ámbito asks also, given the COVID pandemic and the exchange rate crisis, do you think you can offer a quick dispersing facility or not? Well, we have had important steps forward that have been taken. And given recent events on financial markets, we sometimes forget them, by the way, but they are there. The restructuring of private debt is a very, very important part of this piece, I believe. And it will give the public finances in Argentina much greater viability. That is what we have seen elsewhere in the world when there has been a very hard-hitting impact on COVID, but with many fewer economic tools or means by which that pandemic could be offset economically and socially. And that is why the actual design of policies in order to mitigate the impact of the pandemic have been such an important thing. And the government is in the process of coming up with additional measures. And possibly, as you said, if this is done in the short term and if it is deemed to be coherent, and if there is a clear support for those who are most needy, setting the basis for medium-term macroeconomic stability and longer-term growth with the measure of important private investment, then all of that will be a good thing. I certainly would not opine as to the prognosis of that program at this point. I'll certainly have to wait until our team is further advanced in its study of the matter.
Thank you, Alejandro. We switch now into English.
Carol asks why the gold appreciated so much against the dollar in recent weeks. What is the fund's view on this appreciation?
Look, I think the most unwise thing any economist can do is to talk about exchange rate movements. We have not been extremely good at predicting exchange rate movements in the past. I think there were, the kurda depreciated to a significant extent at the beginning of this year. Then on the back of an increase in remittances, it started to appreciate. I think there were also some regulatory changes that were behind this appreciation. And we will continue to see movements in the currency, no? But I think, the country obviously will suffer some negative impacts from a strong currency. But at the end of the day, it's a little bit the normal functioning of currency markets that, on the back of stronger inflows than expected, especially coming from the remittance side, we see some appreciation, and also, as I said before, the effect of these regulatory measures. So that's, as far as we can comment on the specific movements on the exchange rate. I think what it's more important is eventually for Haiti to be able to put together a clear path forward from its very dire situation, economic situation that has gone through in the last 2 years. Now, it will be very important for the country to come together and be able to move forward so that they can start working for the benefit of its population.
Thanks, Alejandro. We're staying in the Caribbean. Sean Cumberbatch from The Nation, Barbados, is asking, is debt relief an option for Caribbean countries faced with increased debt during the pandemic?
Look, in the first stages of the pandemic, from the fund, we provided important emergency financing for the region for about $1 billion. We are continuing to work with all the countries in the region, both at the bilateral level and at the regional level, to explore possibilities to help the Caribbean countries in this, let's call it the second stage of the pandemic, after the rapid financing instruments have been deployed. All ideas are on the table, and basically we need to find let's say a framework for engagement that eventually will allow the region to weather the effects of the pandemic, as I said before, is one of the worst affected regions in the world. And we need to find then the financing instruments that could be, grants, financing, etc., and other types of financial assistance to support these packages. So we're working constantly with the countries. We had a very important meeting on a couple of days ago with many prime ministers from the region, with the head of CARICOM, etc. And we continue to work, and we hope that in the next few months we will see, the products of these deliberations to help the countries in the Caribbean minimize the impact of this very negative shock for the region. I think it's important to say that the region has been able to control the pandemic very, very well. But obviously, the lack of international mobility, as I said before, has significantly hampered the tourism sector, and that it's the lifeline of many countries in the Caribbean, and therefore compensating income is of the utmost importance for these countries, and we're exploring many possibilities to provide this. Thanks.
Thanks, Alejandro. We have another question coming from Eric Martin from Bloomberg. He's in WebEx. Eric, please go ahead.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks, Dr. Warner. Can you hear me? You can hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, but...
Just wanted to confirm. I have a few questions, Dr. Warner, related to Argentina. One is whether the fund is discussing any reforms to the tax and social security systems as part of a revised program with Argentina. If so, what are the nature of the changes being discussed? As Argentina starts to ease the coronavirus lockdown, how are the fund staff and authorities monitoring the impact on prices? And lastly, the gap between the official and the parallel exchange rate in Argentina is starting to have some impact on prices in some sectors. How are you monitoring this in the context of a new IMF program, and what types of measures should Argentina take to narrow that gap? Thank you, Dr.
Well, I'm sorry not to get into the specifics of any of the things that you mentioned, because I mean these are part of the deliberations that our teams are having with the Argentinian authorities. I mean, we're obviously following closely the developments on the, let's say, the price system in Argentina. We're developing closely, we're following closely the evolution of public finances as well as activity, poverty, etc. And this is part of the broad discussions that we're having. And well, once it's up for the Argentinian authorities to put together, as I said before, all the pieces of this economic agenda that will strike this balance between short-run stimulus and support and medium-term macroeconomic stability and long-term inclusive growth. And for us, eventually, once we assess that program will have a significant probability to be successful, I mean, to support it with the financing that comes with an IMF program. So we are in that process. As I said, I mean, the mission will be coming back in November, going back to Buenos Aires in November, and we don't have that much to add to that regarding Argentina. Sorry.
Gracias, Alejandro.
Thank you, Alejandro. We now go to two questions we have online. One is on Colombia from Rodrigo Torres Villamil. He asked, the negative GDP prospects and the high debt level could end in lowering investment rating for countries such as Colombia, correct? Well, we believe that the combination of present fiscal stimulus to households and firms and a boost to the Colombian economy, together with a commitment and mid-term steps that will reach to debt stabilization will allow Colombia to maintain a sustainable route for its public finances, which is why our institutions board increased an increase in the flexible credit line for Colombia, which announced that it will use part of these resources for fiscal support. But I actually cannot issue an opinion on what rating agencies will do or will not do. But here in the IMF, we carried out a macroeconomic analysis and a solvency and sustainability analysis of the debt, of course, and our board determined that Colombia is within the group of countries that has such sound fundamentals that it can have access to the FCL, the flexible credit line, which is why from our institution we see that the public financing situation of Colombia is sound and it is adequately using short-term support, and there's a commitment of fiscal sustainability in the medium term too. Thank you, Alejandro. We now go to a question in English from our colleague Ricardo Bello Repoldo from Agencia Estado.
Does Brazil has fiscal space to continue the fiscal expenditures in 2021 to support the economy?
Look, I think that's a very difficult question. I think Brazil, from the large economies in Latin America, is the economy that has the largest debt as a share of GDP. And on top of that, Brazil implemented a very aggressive fiscal response in 2020. That response was appropriate for the year. It was also well tailored to support families, to support employment, and to support the economy. And it is now the assessment of the authorities that it is very important that now that the Brazilian economy it's recovering, that investment sentiment indexes, consumer confidence indexes are going up, etc. Next year it will be time to send a clear signal that Brazil will stick to its tough fiscal rules, fiscal stance, all of that basically to guarantee debt sustainability. So I think the attitude of erring on the side of being prudent is appropriate given the high levels of debt that Brazil faces, and also the very aggressive response that it launched in 2020 that will help the country to recover faster than other economies. In a risk scenario in which we have, let's say, a return of the pandemic, etc., I mean, obviously, this conservative approach might help Brazil to be able to help the economy once again if this, let's say, a strong second wave hits Latin America. But that's a very risk scenario. And in that sense, I think being prudent in the baseline scenario in which the economy is recovering, it seems like a prudent approach taken by the authorities.
Gracias, Alejandro. Tenemos una pregunta.
Thank you, Alejandro. We have a question from Roberto González Jiménez of La Prensa, who asks, what is the prognosis for Panama debt sustainability? And what do you see for 2021? Will the economy have an uptake, or how do you see that? Well, I think it's important to stress that Panama is undoubtedly one of the best countries that analyze risk in the continent. It has had a very good track record in the last years, and it has access to capital markets that is first class. And so in that regard, it is true that the debt will increase for a good reason. And there's one of the reasons why debt indicators are worsening generally is because the economies are contracting as a result of COVID-19. For Panama, the estimate is a drop of 9% this year. However, for Panama to find a path of growth in the coming year, we think that will be the case. We think Panama will grow 4% next year and probably by the same amount in successive years. And so its fiscal and debt sustainability will be better, even though with higher levels of debt, and it will have to take the necessary measures to find a gradual path toward debt reduction. But we see Panama solidly positioned with regard to its debt, and we think that the sources of recovery will probably be similar to the ones that generated the process the crisis in the first place. The fact that Panama, because of its very positioning and what it is so integrated with the rest of the world economy. As the world economy improves, so too will Panama and all of its logistical sectors. All of this is a hugely important nexus in the economy, not only of Latin America, but I dare say in the world economy. So I think on the whole, there is good news for Panama to the extent that we are seeing that the great economies of the world, like the United States and China, in our forecasts are coming out slightly better off. We feel that the revisions that are ahead are better than we first expected, and that means that it will be better too for the world economy, and as I'm saying, better also for Panama. So probably in the coming months and years, the outlook will be better for Panama. And of course, there's also the question of commodities with the development of new copper mines in Panama. That will be a boost to economy. And we know that the price of copper not only did not drop, but is rising compared to where it stood at the start of the year. Thank you. We now have a question from Alex Segura with regard to Bolivia from Agencia EFE, the Spanish agency. How do you see the government of Luis Arce And what do you believe is the prognosis or the estimate, the forecast, I should say, for the economy? I think Luis Arce was a very fine minister of the economy. He was the minister that led Bolivia through a time of great creativity, great growth, great and very positive room for maneuver for Bolivia that allowed the country to position itself appropriately when it needed to, and to avoid major collapse when the price of gas and oil plummeted. So the former Minister of the Economy, Arce, and now President-elect Arce, it has to say, is one and the same man. He was the architect of a time of very good growth in the Bolivian economy and the creation of positive and solid reserves, which allowed Bolivia to have something to rest on when times got lean. And so what lies ahead? Well, we'll have to see. We'll have to wait until Mr. Arce, in fact, takes the presidency. And certainly I can say we stand ready to assist Bolivia in any way that he and his country would deem best, obviously to the benefit of the very people of Bolivia. But I'd like to stress particularly, it's not very common that we see as electoral results the arrival in power of a former Minister of Finances with whom we have worked hand in hand here at the IMF. It isn't every day that a former Minister of Finance with a very good, tight understanding with the IMF reaches the topmost level of government. So we're looking forward to what comes next, and I hope very much, to the extent that his administration finds that useful, to work closely with Bolivia to boost that economy. Thank you. We have questions from Chile. We have also from Francisca Guerrero of CNN, La Tercera, and from the Mercurio. All of those questions go to the same point. I'm going to read the one of Francisca Guerrera. Here's the question. Do you see in Chile any constitutional debate? And what risks up and down do you see as a result of it? This is, says Mr. Werner, an event that we could see coming. This isn't news. And the Chilean economy has already felt the impact of the political and constitutional uncertainty over the last couple of years, and most assuredly over the last year. However, I believe that as a result of the plebiscite and the constituent process, we're beginning to see that the margin of uncertainty is being lowered. Once Chile has a new constitution, if that is the result of the plebiscite, obviously the room for maneuver will be clearer. If the result of the plebiscite, which was generating uncertainty, seems to point to a period of greater stability through the drafting of a new constitution, that, of course, will be a slightly more solid outlook. I would say that this is a time, as we see it dawning, in which uncertainty will diminish. So the question was, have you included that in your forecast? The answer is yes. I don't say that we expect that the very day after the plebiscite there's going to be a major shift, but we do expect that the level of uncertainty, the margin of uncertainty, will gradually diminish. And whether the movement will be upwards or down, as we've said all along, this constitutional process in Chile really offers the possibility for Chile to continue to be a leader in the region from an economic standpoint. And it could be that that constituent process position Chile in a much more stable and promising position. If that is accompanied by more progressive public finance, better social coverage, and the right measures in terms of social coverage, such that growth of the Chilean economy is dynamic, yes, but more inclusive than it used to be, more embracing, where more people will benefit. All of that will be a good thing. And we see Chile then to continue occupying a position of leader in the region, and it could be that it may be even more so. Much will depend, we believe, on how inclusive Chile is in its social policies. And this period of risk, we hope, will lead to the emergence of social policies, but without the right macroeconomic groundwork, then fiscal and financial risks may grow. If that is the case, then Chile may move away from the model of growth and stability that has been for so long. And therefore, potential private investment and macroeconomic prospects may change. Because in the past, all of that fed into stability and growth. If the level of ambition of Chile is greater in the social area, then that will be one thing. But there may be risks ahead. It will have to see. Thank you. Lastly, Fabián Discordia of Uruguay.
Why do you think Uruguay has been a case of success? What is behind the success? Well, it is apparent that we are not the only ones who think so. This is obvious in the data. That is the success of the containment policies of the virus in Uruguay. And so we should ask maybe public health experts about that. But obviously the fact that they're empowering scientific entities to work on this and to follow the protocols and lines of action set forth by epidemiological experts and medical experts in a country where there is a social cohesion, a broad social cohesion level, also a level of credibility in authorities, and where public health decisions have not become political. All of this has led to an environment where measures designed by experts were followed by the population. They also had a high level of education, a population that in general has, as I said, a high level of education and a very good public health system, one of the best in Latin America. All of that was very important. So I think that among those elements, we can find the answer to the success to these policies. And from the economic point of view, we also see that there is an important agenda of reforms that, if implemented, potentially could promote the growth of the Uruguayan economy in the next few years, allowing it to continue a cycle of stability, growth, complementing it with greater growth and certainty. All of this within an environment of social inclusion, a very high level of social inclusion, which could make many other Latin American countries jealous. So from that point of view, we have seen many aspects of the economic and social policy of Uruguay in the last few years, and now in Lacalle Pou, the President Lacalle Pou's agenda. All of this shows that it's probable that the country will be very successful. And one of the things they have done is to control the pandemic well, and this has allowed Uruguay to minimize the social and economic impact of this crisis that has affected the whole world. Thank you very much, Alejandro. We can then conclude this press conference. Thank you all for following us and for having participated today. We hope you're well, and goodbye.